Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Gonzalez. I'm Manitoba Agriculture's vegetable crop specialist. I'd like to welcome you to the 8th webinar of this year's 2021 Horticulture School Summer Webinar Series. The group that is providing these webinars includes staff from Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, Agriculture Agri-Food Canada, and Assiniboine Community College. Today's webinar, as we've done in the past, will be in the form of a Q&A. So if you have any questions related to horticulture production, even if it's not related to the topic we're discussing, feel free to type them into the question and answer feature on your screen, and we'll do our best to provide you answers to your questions. Today we're going to have two planned areas of discussion. We're open to any questions though. First, we're going to have a discussion on weed control planning for the upcoming season and fall weed control. Secondly, we're going to have a wrap-up discussion on insect issues from this season. So I guess we'll get started. Talise, could you please launch the first two poll questions?
Sure. So we have our first question here, which is, how do you see yourself within the horticulture industry? Producer of horticulture crops, work in agri-supply, agribusiness, government or university personnel, or other? And looks like we have about 57 people have voted so far.
Okay.
86%, that's pretty good.
Yeah, no kidding, eh? Yeah, I'd say go ahead and close at any time.
All right, so it looks like we have 33% who are producer of horticulture crops. We have 33% who work in the agri-supply or agribusiness. 17% of our government or university personnel.
Cool.
So moving on to our second question. So if you are a horticulture producer, what size is your farm? 0 to 4.9 acres, 5 to 14.9 acres, 15 to 49.9 acres, or 50 plus acres? So it looks like we have 13% to have voted. Oh, 25.
Yeah, we might be getting near the max there because about a third of the attendees said they were producers. So we could probably close the poll whenever you're ready.
All right, so yeah, it looks like about 50% are at the 5 to 14.9 acres.
Okay, right on. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. That kind of helps us out. Like I said in my introduction there, first of all, we're going to have a discussion on fall weed control and planning weed control for the upcoming season. Kim Brown, the weed specialist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, is joining us this morning. Thanks for coming in, Kim. And you got any thoughts on fall weed control?
Thanks, Tom, for having me. Yeah, I guess this is a really important time to be looking at weed control for next year. Basically, we're setting our fields up for next year, and we're just trying to figure out, get our land ready and that type of thing. And this is a time too that we kind of try to make sure that we don't have any weeds going to seed, whether they're perennials or whether they're annuals. I think we've seen a lot of weed growth lately. There's been some rains pretty much all over the province, and we've had a real flush of green coming. in most fields. Sometimes crops are actually starting to regrow. Even standing crops are starting to regrow. So you guys may be seeing that. So depends whether we're talking about where you had your horticulture crops this year or where they're going to be next year, depending where you're rotating to. It's really important to get those weeds under control right now, because we don't want anything setting seed. If anything sets seed, whether it be a perennial, now most of those reproduce by roots, but sometimes they do produce by seed as well. Something like a dandelion can. But again, mostly we're talking our annuals type thing, and we really want to get those under control. So whether you're going to be looking at tillage as an option, again, I'm not a big fan of tillage, especially when it's dry, but I know some of our clients that are in the hort industry don't like to use a lot of pesticides. So then that case, tillage is your only option. So then trying to do, a type of tillage that doesn't dry out the soil nearly as much. In those cases, something like plowing, where you invert the soil, is actually better than doing like a lot of heavy cultivation. And then if you are able to use herbicides, then using Roundup and adding in some other products that will help get rid of those weeds, that would do a good job to kind of take those weeds out before freeze up comes.
Yeah, and I think one of the you mentioned not wanting them to go to seed. That's I would venture to say fairly obvious, but in a lot of cases, some of the growers who are using mulch, if it's like a straw mulch or something, a few weeds can be growing through it, or if it's a plastic mulch, weeds can be coming along the edges of it, and a lot of times what we're seeing, even depending on the scale of the operation, is some mowing even just to knock big weeds down, or on a smaller scale using walking through with a whippersnapper or something. You're not retarding the growth per se, in the sense of the weed is still rooted in the ground, but you're not adding to the seed bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in lots of cases too, mowing can do a really good job of taking the tops of the plants off. Some of our weeds will just end up setting seed below where you've mowed. We're pretty late in the year maybe for that to happen, but I mean, we just think of dandelions and things like that. If you mow them, they'll end up just flowering right on the ground. And a few other things like the stalk, if you cut it earlier in the year, it will just flower below where you cut, and they will flower right on the ground too. I think we're late enough in the year that mowing now, that shouldn't happen. And again, that would be a good way of getting rid of some of the top growth. And I'm just concerned about using up the moisture in the soil as well. Like if we allow the weeds to still grow, they're going to use up the moisture. But we have to be careful too with tillage, because tillage can dry out the soil. And even though we've had rain, we're still in a moisture deficit, and we need to be really careful of that and not use up too much water this fall, because next spring's crop is going to need it. But chemists using herbicides, a Roundup with like a good liter of Roundup plus, you can add in a few products depending whether or not, depending what you're growing next year for your hort crops. But even, a good shot of Roundup in the fall, if that's something that works on your farm, that is something that I would look at doing right now, and that'll take care of those weeds. If we waited until, say, maybe even early October, that should take care of some of the winter annuals as well. If we spray a little bit too early, and if you're only going to spray once, you might miss some of those winter annuals because they maybe haven't germinated yet, or they're just pretty little. Those are our weeds that germinate in the fall, and then they go dormant over winter, and then come spring, they start growing right away, and they can get really big really fast in the spring because they've had a head start. So those ones too, if you were going to spray, you could hang on just a little bit on that and wait until there's maybe a few more of those up.
Right. I have noticed in some years where the fall's being fairly open, in the sense of a frost maybe middle to late November even, as in some years we've seen really good control with Roundup, in the sense that it's had that much more time to work I know even this summer, with the weeds being, how can we say it, stressed like everything else was with lack of water. Well, holy smokes! Once they got some water, if they had the glyphosate application, it really started to show. So they obviously translocated some of that. They just didn't express the symptoms immediately because the conditions weren't ripe for growth. But it definitely worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that actually reminded me of something, Todd. Sorry, to tell you that if you're going to be doing Roundup or glyphosate, make sure you give it time to work before to translocate into the roots, and that we don't. If we are going to end up doing some tillage, and maybe we do get some more rain, and you decide you can do some tillage, you need to give it some time to get into the roots and do a really good job. So you would want to wait at least 3 days, probably longer would be better, especially on some of the perennials. But yeah, even if we do have a late frost, we do see really good weed control even quite late in the year, as long as there is time for that herbicide to get down into the roots and do a good job. And then come spring, you've got a nice clean seed bed to plant into. There'll be nothing but carcasses from this fall's weeds, and that's what we'd like to see.
Right. Now, when it comes to, you're talking, I think you mentioned sort of at least 3 days. Is that at all temperature dependent? Like if we had cooler weather, would 3 days be enough, or do you want to stretch that a little bit?
Well, longer would be better. You'd want minimum 3 days no matter what the weather. And honestly, if we have cool weather, it depends on growing conditions, because we need the weeds to be growing well in order to take up herbicide in order to kill them. So if things aren't going well, even if we've had some cool nights, so if we've had a bit of frost, now we really haven't had any. I think there's been just a touch of frost just south of Riding Mountain National Park, but not much. So really, so far, we're mid-September. We haven't had our frosts yet, although, we're looking at they're imminent. So after a frost, if it's a hard frost, you need to wait. You probably should wait a couple of days, 2 to 3 days after a frost, to make sure that the weeds are growing. Because again, we need them to be actively growing, and in order to take up the herbicide. And so after a good hard frost, you'd wait 2 or 3 days. Some weeds like dandelions can still, they can take a frost pretty good, but you can still get good kill on those after. Some of our weeds just might be dead after the frost, and there's no point spraying. So it's good to evaluate and see whether or not you need to spray that or not. And then normally, though, when you're spraying, you'd like your temperatures to be kind of 8 degrees and above, like so daytime temperatures, 8 degrees and above for at least 3-4 hours after you spray that herbicide to get it initially into the plant. So that's usually like a late morning or an early afternoon kind of thing, mid to late morning, early afternoon. Give that plant, you need that 8 degrees for, at least a couple hours, and I'd prefer 4 or 5 hours and that type of thing. And then after that, hopefully some good weather, it'll let the herbicide work better. But no matter what the weather, you'd want at least 3 days. Especially to get into the roots of the perennials. That's really why. That's where glyphosate's really going to work. I mean, it can kill your annuals and maybe stop them from going to seed, but really that's where we're using it in the fall to go after our perennial weeds.
Right.
Our quack, our thistles, our dandelions, lots of those type things.
For sure. Any additional thoughts, summing up at all, Kim? Or, I mean, we seem to have, I'm just checking questions here. I haven't seen any questions show up. Anything you'd like to add before we move on? Or?
Yeah, I was going to plug for cleavers.
Oh, yes.
I'm on a cleavers hunt right now. I'm actually joining by phone because I'm in the northwest part of the province. I'm looking for cleavers. We normally do have cleavers kind of around the province, maybe not necessarily right in the south. but we do have them around the province, and it's been so dry this year, we really haven't seen any. So I'm gathering them, the plants, in order to get the seed out in order to use for a study. I'm sending them to Lethbridge I'm working with Agriculture Canada, and just gathering up some cleavers from around the province. So if anybody does have any cleavers on their farm or in their, in their horticulture crops, because those crops can get a little bit weedy, let me know. And I would like to come and get them. I need quite a bit of them. I need more than just a handful, just because they don't technically have a lot of seed on them. So anyways, that's just a plug for if anybody has those around and I could come gather them, I would happily do that. And another thing, we have had a lot of more pigweed weeds showing up in the province. Some of these are noxious, tier 1 noxious weeds, which means that they need to be destroyed. They're not allowed to be here. They can be very destructive, very invasive, resistant to a lot of chemical groups. So for our broad scale agriculture crops, they really pose a big risk. So just if anybody's got some strange looking weeds that they're not quite sure on, you can send me pictures or send them to Tom, and Tom can get them to me, but you have my contact information. I'd really like to get, just really like to get a handle on if there are some of these weeds showing up in different places. Normally with our hort crops and our smaller acreage crops, a lot of these weeds can just be hand pulled, but these weeds are very prolific seed producers. Like, you're routinely looking at 250,000 to 500,000 seeds on a plant. So they're the tiny, tiny little black shiny seeds. They're about the size of a fly speck type thing. Very, very tiny, usually very shiny black. So these pigweeds, there's about 6 or 7 different kinds in the province. Red root pigweed, I think we're all familiar with, but there's some other ones as well that are more aggressive and quite a bit scarier than red root pigweed. So if anybody has anything they're a little concerned about, just send us pictures. It might turn out to be something completely different, that's fine. But we do want to get a handle on where some of these pigweeds are showing up. So we would appreciate that information as well if you guys could share.
Yeah, and
probably Tom.
Sorry, Kim, I was just going to say, you can let anybody know, myself or Kim or whoever, like, we can try to identify it by the picture, and if that doesn't work out, we can come out and see what it is, or get a sample, or whatever we need to try to get a handle on what it is for you. Okay, well, thanks very much for your time, Kim. I know you're busy today, so I appreciate taking the time to join us. Thanks again.
Okay. No, thank you. I'll go on mute, so I'll listen till the end of the webinar. And if there is any questions come up, I'll try to answer them. And if I don't get to them, then please, Tom will get them to me, and I'll get back to whoever's asked the question. Okay? Okay. Thanks very much.
Kim, thanks very much. So I think we'll move to our second session, our discussion for this morning. Talise, could you launch that third poll question, please?
Sure. So the third question is, which of the following can be predators of other insects? Green lacewings, crickets, yellowjackets, all of the above, or none of the above?
Do we have brave souls venturing answers yet?
I have 17% who voted so far.
17% are brave. What do we have? That's
I'm up to 50% now.
Oh, okay. There, now we're getting up there. That's better. Okay, well, I would say we could close it. Just
all right, so it looks like 33% of the green lacewings.
Okay.
Any
crickets or wasps or?
No, it doesn't look like any other has voted. There was a potential of an all of the above, but it's not intentionally a solid vote answer.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so the green lacewings in the battle there. Okay, so we're gonna have a look at some of the late season insects. And our computer is just being slow and pokey here. So yeah, I'm John Gavlowski, and I'm entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. And so what I'm going to do is go over some of the late season insects that we've been seeing in Manitoba. Just gonna go, oops. Oop, I must have missed a slide in here. Anyway, I'm gonna go over 6 different insects with you that we've been seeing quite a bit of in Manitoba. So I'm gonna cover grasshoppers, obviously. I'm also gonna cover crickets, just because I've been getting a lot of questions on crickets and why there's so many and what they do, what they eat, all those type of things. Diamondback moth we will cover because we did have quite a few of them, particularly late season. Flea beetles in your cruciferous crops, they were hanging around in big numbers.
Yes.
Then I'm going to cover a couple other ones that people have been seeing a lot of. Green lacewings, which was part of our poll question. They are a natural enemy, a predator, and there were a lot of them around this year, so we'll look at those. And I'm going to wrap up by also covering yellowjackets, because right now there seems to be a lot of them around in some areas, and people are asking, where are they coming from? Why are they here? What are they doing? Is there any good to these things? So we'll cover some of those questions as well. And we will start with grasshoppers. I don't know if we've got the right presentation up here, Tom. Nope, this is the wrong.
Okay, I just went to the link.
I probably sent you the wrong one.
Okay, so we're just we got a little techno.
Yeah, if we can go to the P drive, let's pull up the right one. Give us 2 minutes here. We're going to do a presentation change. Oops.
Never fails. There's always some kind of
Always a
techno
glitch,
scratch.
but that's okay. We will get the right one up. And Hort School, September 2021. That's the one we wanted.
And of course, going to take a second or more than a second to load. And I think, yeah, just you can use that little icon there and display settings and swap view. And there, we should be ready to go.
Okay, so this is looking a little better. There we go. So there's the 6 insects that I just talked about. And on to the first one, grasshoppers. So again, when we talk grasshoppers, we're talking about lots of different types. There's roughly 80 species in Manitoba. There's 4 of them roughly that we consider potential pests. These have been the 2 most dominant this year, the two-striped and the clearwing. They're very different in what they feed on. Two-striped feeds on mostly anything green. It's very much a generalist, so they will move around from crop to crop quite a bit, which is what's happening right now. Clearwing grasshopper, a grass specialist. So they may move into a broadleaf crop, but then they will quickly realize, I don't like this, and they will move looking for a grassy crop. And we did have instances like that where people were calling saying, they're in my crop, but they're not feeding. And we realized it was clearwing they were dealing with and told them, give it a day or 2, they'll be somewhere else, probably a neighbor's wheat field or something. So what grasshoppers are doing right now, as mentioned, is they are moving around. Now numbers are declining. We don't have any new grasshoppers for our pest species produced once we start getting into July. The egg hatch, all of our pest species overwinter as eggs. The eggs hatch usually late May and throughout June, but once we get into July, egg hatch is done. There's no new grasshoppers produced. So if you think you are seeing a population increasing, either they're just getting bigger and moving around more and you're noticing them more, or maybe they are moving in from another area, but they're not hatching out in your fields in late July and August. That's just not happening. In fact, what does start happening as we go through August, populations start declining. And as we get into September, they really start declining. Once we get a good hard frost, you'll pretty much start seeing the end of them. We haven't had those frosts yet, as Kim was mentioning, but populations have been declining. Now, I would say if you do have any lush green vegetation still in your fields, do keep an eye on it, because especially if it is the last remnants of green stuff in the area, they will start concentrating. They're the ones that are remaining. But again, populations are now declining. The egg laying usually happens throughout August and early September. And I usually tell people, don't anticipate good winter kill, because usually all you need is a little bit of snow cover and the eggs survive quite well. And they are smart enough to lay their eggs where there is some lush green vegetation, which is often late in the season, your field edges and ditches and places like that, pasture lands where snow does accumulate. So we usually don't get a lot of good winter kill. What could take a population down is really heavy rains when the egg hatch is occurring in the late spring. And there's natural enemies out there too that we have been seeing a lot of. Bee flies, there's a species called the grasshopper bee fly that we noticed a lot of this year. Their juveniles eat nothing but grasshopper eggs. There's blister beetles, that same thing. Juveniles of some species only eat grasshopper eggs. And the next one on my list, field crickets, they also eat grasshopper eggs. So I'll give away my poll question. All of the above was actually the correct answer. All of the insects in that poll question are predators to some degree. Now, field crickets, there are a lot of them around right now. The same conditions that often are good for grasshoppers and build their population also tend to build field cricket populations. Now, I'm using the word field cricket. When we talk about crickets, we've actually got 17 species in Manitoba. 2 of them are called field crickets. Those are the ones you're mainly seeing right now. We do have a few other species, 5 of them called ground crickets, that will look very much like this field cricket, but a bit smaller. So if you see what looks like an adult cricket, but it's a bit smaller and solid black and just doesn't look quite right, it might be a ground cricket. We've actually got 4 species of tree crickets. You probably will hear them more than you will see them. They're in the trees, as the name would imply. You will hear them with their long trills late in the summer. You might have wondered what is doing that. That's tree crickets. And then we have 6 species called camel crickets that don't have wings, have kind of a humpback, which is why they call them camel crickets. And they like moisture and damp areas, and sometimes we find them under stubble in the field or debris. They're usually feeding on that decaying stuff. Now, field crickets themselves are omnivores, meaning they eat plant material, they eat animal material. With the plant material, they do a lot of their feeding at ground level, and they do like to feed on dead vegetation, seeds, weed seeds even. They can be actually quite valuable weed seed predators. Sometimes they will nibble at, if there's fruit on the ground, lying on the ground, they will nibble at it. We have seen them climb plants and feed on upper parts, but they often don't do significant damage doing that. And as mentioned, they do eat things like grasshopper eggs and other insects too, apple maggot pupa, green clover worm pupa. They've been known to feed on those. So they do feed on some insects. And just to give you an example of how many weed seeds they can eat, there was actually a study done in University of Michigan where they basically took hungry field crickets and then put them in a container with nothing but a particular type of weed seed. And in 24 hours, they measured what they ate. And just to read you some stats here. So in 24 hours, female and male fall field crickets ate an average of 12 or 8 velvet leaf seeds, 26 or 9 green foxtail seeds, 87 or 69 crabgrass seeds. And here's where the big numbers start. 223 or 90 red root pigweed seeds. So some of the bigger seeds, like the red root pigweed, well, these were hungry crickets that had obviously been not been feeding before the study. So when they've got lots of different things to choose from the field, they're probably not eating 200 red root pigweed seeds per day, but potentially, if they're hungry and that's all there is there, they can consume a lot of weed seeds is the bottom line story from that study. So crickets, they do have their good side to them as well. Flea beetles, So when I'm talking about flea beetles here, I'm talking about striped and crucifer, the ones that feed on your cruciferous vegetables and any cruciferous plant, canola, mustard, but also cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale. They're crucifer specialists. And they're just 2 of our roughly 72 species of flea beetles in Manitoba. But these 2 they're the dominant species that we have in Manitoba. And what you're seeing right now are a completely different set of flea beetles than what you saw in the spring. So the flea beetles that were there in May and June, they've laid their eggs and died. Those eggs have hatched. The larvae fed on the roots of the plants a little bit, usually not significantly over the summer. And now you've got another set of adults. And these adults are going to spend the winter, and they're going to be the exact same adults that you see next spring. That's the way their cycle works. It's a 1-year life cycle, but you see the adults twice. You will see a spring population, a fall population, which is next year's spring population. And there are a lot out there still. And anyone who's growing crucifer crops, I'm sure you're battling with them, because once the canola gets harvested, you have a lot of flea beetles. And the same thing as we saw with the grasshoppers, they start getting concentrated. Their host plants are disappearing, and they would still want to feed a little bit before they, in this case, before they start overwintering. So they will concentrate on those late season crucifers. I've talked to some people who said they were using row covers and having some success, which I think can work. But it depends on your operation, how practical that might be. Other people, they rely on insecticides, and an unfortunate thing is sometimes they do have to go out there repeatedly when we get into the late summer, because it's just such a battle with them. There's so many of them, and they can just keep moving in from other areas. Now, another crucifer specialist that we had a lot of this year was Diamondback moth. And this is a different insect in many ways than flea beetles. They don't overwinter well in Manitoba. They blow in as an adult moth, and they usually cycle through 3 or 4 generations per season. And I'm thinking, based on when they moved in this year, we've had at least 3, possibly 4 generations of them. They do not overwinter well here, though. So they will all die, or mainly all die, when the colder weather hits. So for next year, it really does depend on what blows in. You get the winter will seriously damage their populations. Years ago, we put up emergence cages in some fields to see if we could detect overwintering in Manitoba, and we couldn't. Now, anecdotally, I think I have found some moths in really good shape on sticky traps early in the season that may have survived a winter, but if they are surviving, it's not in high levels. So we'll get a bit of a reprieve. So the final 2, and the next one I'm going to cover is lacewings. This is a beneficial insect with no bad side to it at all, really. What I'm showing here is the green lacewing. There's different types of lacewings. This is what we had a lot of this year. Some of the vegetable fields, I know there was a lot. Some of the field crops, I went into a quinoa field near Elm Creek, and I couldn't believe the levels of lacewings in there. Now, they had a fairly heavy lygus bug populations, not a lot of aphids, and I'm thinking they might have been feeding on the lygus. They're very quick. And on the right of your screen is a larva. They look like little brown alligators. They're really quick, and I've actually seen them catch lygus bug nymphs and eat them. It's kind of fun to watch. Actually, what they do is they've got these big pincers for mandibles, and they grab it and they inject some digestive enzymes into the lygus or whatever they've caught, and then they start sucking the juice out of it, and eventually you end up with just a little bit of cuticle left, which they discard and move away. But yeah, they're kind of neat. And what you see on the bottom are the eggs, which are laid on stalks. So you have these eggs that are all on stalks. If you start seeing a lot of that, that's lacewing eggs. They'll eat anything their size or smaller that moves, including their siblings. So the hypothesis is that with the eggs being on stalks, they can basically survive their siblings a bit better.
Right.
So That's just one of the ideas. And I showed this video at one of the previous hort schools, but it's a cool one, so I'm going to show it again. This is actually a green lacewing larva feeding on aphids. It's part of our filter series.
The stealthy lacewing larva approaches its prey. They aren't called aphid lion for nothing. Attack! The lacewing skewers the aphid with her sickle-shaped mandibles and shakes her prey above her head. The lacewing injects the aphid with digestive enzyme and consumes her liquefied dinner. That little one on the left shouldn't stick around. They could be next on the menu.
Okay, always entertaining to watch the lacewings feed. So we will move on to our final insect that I was going to cover in our insects we're seeing lots of series. This is Yellowjackets, and I'm not using the word wasp here. Most people just call them wasps, but wasp actually refers to thousands of species, literally thousands of species that are present. Most wasps, though, can't sting you and are nothing but beneficial, attacking other insects, parasitizing them. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm using the term Yellowjackets, and Yellowjackets actually refers to anything that belongs to two different genuses of insects. One's called Vespula. These are your aerial Yellowjackets. These are the ones that make the nests in your eaves troughs or out from a tree branch or something, so aerial nests. And then you have another group, your Vespula, which is your cavity nesters. So this is your eastern Yellowjacket, your western Yellowjacket, your German Yellowjacket. They make their nests in the ground. And so yeah, these are the ones that you might accidentally run over with your lawnmower or see in a field that accidentally disturb nesting in the ground. So those are the ones that we call Yellowjackets. And so good or bad, I guess it depends on perspective.
Right.
And when you're seeing them. Now, when Yellowjackets start out, Yellowjackets are very different than bees. Bees, I'll use the example of honeybees. Honeybees overwinter as a big group, queens, workers, in a big cluster in a hive. Yellowjackets is only the queens that survive the winter. And they're usually under some bark or something. So they're starting a new nest every year, a single queen. And so that it has to gradually build throughout the year. So levels are small in the spring. Now, when the workers finally do emerge, they've got young to feed, and the young need protein. So the young eat things like insects, mainly insects, actually. Problem is the young can't move. They're a little grub in a nest. So the adults are out scavenging for caterpillars, flies, pretty much any insect that they can pull off of a plant or from anywhere. If there's a piece of meat or roadkill, whatever, they'll get in there too and start to try to tear a piece of meat out. But they want meat, they want protein for their young. So they're out there catching caterpillars and things, bringing them to the nest, feeding them to the young. So they're beneficial in that regard early in the season. Now, the young produce this sugary stuff that they feed to the adults. So the adults like carbs. So they get a little bit of sugary stuff from the young, and they will take a little bit of nectar and things early in the season. But they're really not a big nuisance until we get into about August. And what happens in late summer is the queen, instead of just laying workers, starts laying other queens. And too many queens spoil the nest in this case. The colony just goes into chaos. The old queen will die, so there's no new young being produced. The workers that were there now don't have young to feed. They're now just living life for themselves, basically, but they still want to feed. And they will often leave the nest, and they're basically foraging outside the nest just for themselves. They're looking for usually carbs to feed on. So anything sweet, your pop can sitting there, a piece of fruit that you might have taken out, that corn on the cob that you're trying to eat. They're just drawn to anything where they can get a bit of carbs late in the season. They're going to die soon. Workers don't survive the winter. They're just getting a few last meals in. Only the queens are going to survive. So that's why so many late in the summer, and good or bad, depends on perspective. They do have a positive side, like I said, early in the season. So pretty much all of the insects I showed you today, except for the flea beetles and diamondback moth, are predators. Those are the only two that are strictly plant feeders. So we can end with that, and hopefully there's some insect questions that people might have.
Yeah, I'll just see if I can find the questions. Talise, has anyone posted a question in the Q&A?
It looks like there is the one. And are there other eggs similar in appearance to the green lacewing eggs on stems?
Short answer, no, not around here. Now, there are different species of green lacewings, but they do have distinctive eggs. So if you're seeing eggs on stalks, you can almost be certain that it's going to be some type of species of green lacewing.
Okay. Just switching gears a little bit from horticulture, what about wasps? What about wasps that like to go inside a roof, say, like underneath decking, and they would seem to want something over their head, but they're not in the ground. Their nest is not the classic kind of round
Yes.
nest, but yet it's not on the ground. What type of wasp is that?
So that is probably, I gave the two different types, the aerial and the cavity nesters. That'll be one of the cavity nesters.
Okay.
Cavity nesters often are in the ground, but they can be in hollow in a tree, under siding,
Right.
Anywhere where they can find a cavity, basically.
Okay.
In the ground is convenient, but yeah, they certainly can be. And usually if you do have a nest under siding, it'll be around here. It's usually either Eastern, Western, or German yellowjacket, one of the cavity nesting species.
Okay.
And the aerial ones are easy to see because they make those kind of Chinese lantern type of papery nests. They're just very different the way they make their nests in the cavity.
Yeah, that's the common one that I'm used to, the common nest, I mean, that I'm used to kind of seeing around and stumbling on. But okay, so just what else is there? Here's a question. Is there any predatory insects for the cabbage white butterfly?
Yes, and there's actually quite a few, and particularly when they're small, there's a lot of things that will eat them. There's both predators, a lot of generalist predators, and there's also parasites. So just to give you a few examples, when they're really young, when even the egg stage, eggs, you're going to have things like lady beetles, those lacewing larvae that I showed you. Lacewing larvae, quick, and they will feed on, like I said, anything. Their size are small, but sometimes even things bigger. So definitely lacewing larvae would be one of them. I'll throw in ladybugs and ladybug larvae for maybe the egg stage and really young caterpillars. There's another one called damsel bug, and it's a very long, narrow predatory bug with a beak on it, and they love caterpillars, so especially smaller caterpillars, so they definitely would be in there feeding. There's parasitic wasps that I mentioned that would lay eggs into them. There's several different types of ichneummonid and braconid wasps that would, I'm sure, love to lay eggs into them. And then there's also things like ground beetles. There's a few species that love caterpillars, will climb plants to some degree. The problem is a lot of ground beetles do like to forage more at ground level, so they may not be consuming as many as, say, the lacewings and the damsel bugs. And then you have a few other ones that maybe are less common, such as robber flies. Robber flies would definitely go and pick off the odd caterpillar. And the wasps that I showed you, the yellowjackets, even early in the season, the cabbage butterfly larva or the imported cabbage worm, they would be a great food source for the young of the yellowjackets.
Right on. Here's another one. Is grasshopper occurrence related, I think it should be, to dry weather, or does it occur based on its cycle?
There definitely is a connection between grasshoppers and dry weather. There's been numerous studies on that. Now, I'm saying that as a statement that applies to the Canadian prairies. The situation is totally different for the locust populations in Africa and Asia. There they need the monsoon rains to get the green growth that gets their cycle going. It's different here. Dry weather is what spurs our cycles. There's a few reasons for it. One is that rain is actually one of the natural controls of grasshoppers. If we get too much when they're very young, that can be detrimental to them. There's also a pathogenic fungus. It's called Entomophaga grilli. And if we get a period of really damp, humid, rainy weather that goes on for like a couple weeks, you start to see dead grasshoppers clinging to the top of plants. And they're infected with the spores of this fungus. And eventually the spores fill their body and their cuticle splits open, and being dead at the top of the plants, the spores just spread around. So you get more of that pathogen if it's too damp and humid. Now, the other way that dry weather contributes to more grasshopper damage, those are ways it contributes to more grasshoppers. But also when we get really dry weather, there's less natural vegetation on the landscape. And our pest species of grasshoppers are all generalists, meaning they feed on lots of things. And if there's less of this natural vegetation to feed on, it concentrates them in your crops a bit more. So that's the other connection between dry weather and grasshopper damage to crops.
And certainly in most cases, horticulture crops have some form of irrigation, and in dry weather they can be an oasis of green.
Yes.
In an agricultural setting, you know, just because of lack of rain, but yet irrigation on the horticulture crops. Let's see if I can find any other questions. I'm not seeing any. Talise, have I missed any questions?
No, it looks like you covered them.
Okay, right on. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. We value your feedback, both good and bad, because it'll allow us to provide a better product. So feel free to let us know what you think and be honest. The webinar series will continue 2 weeks from now on October 1st at 9:30. We'll have topics out probably in the early part of that week. Yeah, so I'll do one last check of the questions. I'm not seeing any. So I think that's it. I'll say thanks and hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.